Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Irony is the Truest Medicine. I'm Jeremy Sherman. If you've been listening for a while, you might come away with various impressions. One is that this is all very well, but a little abstract. Another is that it's too technical and may not actually pertain to your life. At least that would be a common response to what I'm offering here. And I want to offer a reason why it's not. First of all, it's about life, and you're living one. We're living lives, and they matter to us. Second, the world is in trouble, and you see that, and I think you can see that, and you probably have theories or conclusions about why it's in trouble. And I'm going to argue that those conclusions, of which there are a great many, are abstract and impressionistic. They're not actually grounded in physical reality. And that's the predicament humankind is in. In fact, I would argue that that is why we're in trouble. We are a word-wielding species, and words are effortless to wield. We can imagine, describe, explain anything. We can take words, manipulate them, put them in whatever order, and come to conclusions. And they're often very satisfying conclusions. Conclusions that make us feel proud of ourselves for having the conclusions, and also like we know how we would fix the world if we were in charge of it. This is just a human condition. This is human nature. We ended up with words. We're a symbol-competent organism. And as a result, we get to wield words like no other creature. We live in two worlds. We live in the world of physical reality that we're stuck in, but we also live in the world of our own minds and imaginations and society's imaginations. So words become a way that we can model reality effortlessly and incorrectly. And I think that's the real problem that we're dealing with all sorts of consequences which you can point to and make the emphasis. But I want to go down to the roots of it. Life has been struggling for its own existence. Organisms have been struggling for their own existence for 3.8 billion years, and here we are doing that more anxiously because we have words and more delusionally because we have words. So I think the world is in trouble because of that, and here's one illustration of how that plays out. You've got two major camps that defy each other. There's the religious or spiritual or dualist realm, where you've got people who assume there has to be something beyond the physical reality we're in because the physical reality can't explain what we are. So this would include anybody who assumes God or a higher power. And as I've argued in past episodes, even scientists who just assume that there's this extra substance called information. Then you've got on the other side the eliminativists, the people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. I admire them. They were important inspirations for me, but their argument doesn't really hold up. Their argument is that random and natural selection, the process of elimination, is sufficient to explain us. What I'm proposing in these episodes is a different approach, which is you've got to explain how we are something different within nothing but physical chemistry. So I'm not taking the easy, wordy route of just assuming dualism and then forgetting that we're assuming it. Assuming that there must be a God, a spirit, information. There's others as well. Quantum consciousness. I only get to work with physical, material things that happen because of change, dynamics. Nonetheless, I have to explain how we, as something radically different, could emerge within nothing but physical chemistry. If we continue to dodge the question of how trying even emerges from physics at all, we're doomed. And I think it's actually as big a social issue as that, a civilization determining issue as that. So the burden is on me to explain within nothing but physical chemistry, even simple physical chemistry. And while it's unfamiliar to many, like I've said before, we're all self-obsessed and trying to figure out what to do, but we very rarely, if ever, stop to figure out what selves and trying are. It's unfamiliar, but It's actually simple, the kind of explanation that would be disappointing to the theory wielders because they want something more dramatic, and I think it's actually simpler. You start with nothing but physical chemistry. You start with the tendency for everything to fall apart, and you have to explain how, instead of anything happening, only some things happen and not others. How we prevent our own death. How we ongoingly do our own prevention of our own undoing. That's what I've got to explain, and it's got to be simple because there are no engineers, and it can't start complicatedly, and there's no natural selection. There's no refinement. We're starting at the most basic level to explain what we are, and then building up from there in what I'm now calling metadynamics. So the word dynamic means change. And metadynamics, meta can mean many things, but what it mostly means these days is about, something about itself. It's recursiveness. So when we talk about metacognition, we're talking about thinking about thinking. What would metadynamics be? It would be how change changes. And I'm suggesting that it changes by means of constraints, preventions, constraints compounding atop constraints. Once some possibilities are prevented, other possibilities can be prevented atop those preventions, all the way out to us. So it's very unlikely that the first selves in the universe would survive. But if a few did, then they could accumulate by natural selection, by evolution, the further constraints, all the way out to the fine-tuning that we humans do. One of the challenges here is that we're talking about constraints that enable us to do things. For example, anything you do that requires articulate movement, that is, care in how you move your fingers or your feet, those are abilities, but they come about as a result of your self-control, your reduction of possible movements. That's the theme here, is that you get constraints that enable us to do things, enabling constraints. And it's kind of counterintuitive, and yet it's also very intuitive. Think of all the things you do and all the things you don't do, all the things you prevent yourself from doing. Think of how you focus on your work. You deliberate yourself through self-control. You unfree yourself from just dithering, and that's how you end up with the capabilities you've got. So I've got to explain how change changes, and that is explaining how constraints compound. And just to be clear about what a constraint is, in strictly physical terms, constraint is how form happens. There's matter and there's form, but they are not really separate. They can't be separate. All matter has form, and all form happens in matter. I've called it cluster fluxes. And I'm not trying to be cute there. It's actually a very accurate. You keep your behaviors within limited range. The range varies a little bit. It's not precise. It's not absolutely precise. It's not black and white. But you keep it within viable range, and that's what a cluster flux is. So constraint, where you're likely and unlikely to find matter and energy. That's what form is. Constraint is the limitations on possibilities. I think of unlikeliness as any form, whatever that form is, however motile. The form has likely and unlikely locations of matter. Think about it in terms of donuts. A donut is a form, the relative presence and absence of matter in space and time. That's all form is. And there is no formless matter, and there is nothing immaterial. There is no other reality, no dualist reality where you've got information or spirit or something like that. All you got is form. But once you get form that is constrained, other forms can form between form. It's unlikelying, it's unlikelifying. I am unlikelifying my own and your own death every day. That's what you do. And you do it through this compounded constraint. Form limitations building on form limitations. How would that happen? I'm going to go back to words for a second to explain how it doesn't happen and the trouble we get into if we pretend that words explain it or math explains it. Math is also symbols. So I can imagine making a model to explain how life works. I imagine I'm an engineer, and I build a box and arrow model of how the world works. I could do it as a diagram, but I could also just describe it. And religious people, spiritual people, scientists do this all the time. It's kind of an abstract engineering. It's vague on what's going on inside the black boxes and arrows in these diagrams. It's vague because you can treat those boxes like they're computer modules, like they're algorithms, but you can also pretend that they have purposeful behavior. This is where engineering becomes a distraction. I can design a device to serve my purposes, but if I'm trying to explain life, I don't get to do that. I have to explain how it gets its own purposes, how an organism gains the purposeful behavior of unlikelifying its own death. But if I'm working in abstractions and diagrams, I can just assume that, for example, a hormone triggers a motivation. And I can make all sorts of models. I never have to build the things. An engineer has to build. I'm just coming up with an abstract engineering model of how things work. So hormone triggers a motivation. Okay, well, a hormone doesn't have motivations. So you're kind of assuming that this chemical triggers a black box, a motivation, an appetite, an urge, a drive, whatever you want to call it. Well, what is that drive? Where is the trying in that model? Now, I can make really fancy, elaborate models, and I can feel all scientific for it. I can put numbers to it. I can quantify it. And I still am just working in the realm of abstractions. And I think that's gotten us into a lot of trouble. I think it's got us in enough trouble that it could be the end of civilization. May sound melodramatic, but hear me out if you're willing. I'm going to call it symboloma, cancer of the symbols. We get movements that are really powerful, really invasive, aggressive movements. An example would be fascism, or Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin's dogmas around how we don't really even need humans anymore because AI will take over the world, or we certainly don't need blue-collar workers or women anymore because we can get all those services provided by computers. Or take Trumpism. It's just a perfect example of this. They're word-wielding, and since words are so effortless, you can always compound your words to make it so that your model stays coherent. You can add more and more justifications, more and more constraints to prevent people from saying your theory is wrong. So religions have been doing this for millennia. That's what faith is about. If you start from an article of faith, which is a comfort in your own skin, confidence, the sense that you have solved reality, and anybody brings you any news that disturbs your sense of reality, you just wield some more words to justify your sense of things. And you can end up with a very popular movement that brings comfort to a lot of people's skin, and it will tend to override other theories, other approaches, the way that Trump fascism is overriding our old sense of the United States. So whatever the dogma, and I don't really care what it is, I'm paying attention to the word wielding we do and the damage it does to our world. You end up with these very aggressive movements that are like cancers. They're social cancers. I'm not using that as a vague metaphor or as a way of spitting anger at it. I'm saying it is like a cancer. The conversion of people to some fake engineered, world-wielded dogma keeps on happening over and over in this world. And I think it's because we're wielding words and forgetting the world in the process. So my prognosis for civilization, if we don't somehow alter our course, would be exactly this. I've called it a dissociation death spiral or a dumbass death spiral. That is, as reality gets more difficult, people will check out into these abstract models of how things work for comfort in their own skin, and thereby neglect the world, which will in turn get worse, which will in turn motivate people to escape all the more, to dissociate all the more. I'm saying we are a problematic, dissociative creature because we have words, and it could be our end. So this is the reason why I think it's crucial these days that we come up with a better explanation for what we are. As I've said many times before, I think we've about used up the Earth's carrying capacity for our self-flattering abstractions. Words have probably terminated many extraterrestrial species. Once you get words, you get detached from reality, dissociate from reality, and it becomes more perilous, which makes you dissociate all the more. So I see that as our situation, and I'm going to give you an example of how daunting I find the circumstances. You've got these cancers of the symbols, aggressive, invasive processes, and they are very successful. And so for me, there's now a question about whether or not democracy can prevent the overrun by fascist or dictatorial or tyrannical movements, these symbolnomas. My guess is that they're not very good at it. So here's the bind I see us in. In a world where dictatorship is galloping forward, I don't see democracy or a free society as a bulwark that will override them. The way I thought it would work when I was younger. We just come out of World War II, and democracy had overrun fascism, and I thought that was the formula. Democracy had overridden fascism. Democracy had routed fascism. And I thought, well, that's how the world works. Democracy is a better system. It's better for society. The people will rise up and demand a better world, and the fascists will die in their own bullshit. That's what I thought. I'm not convinced of that anymore. So when you get tyrants or tyrant wannabes like Trump and Vance and Yarvin and that whole gang, I think they're terrible for humankind. But I think they're probably more successful than democracies. And I don't know what to do about that because I'm all in favor of democracy. I'm trying to be honest about the predicament. I don't want to run on hope. I think it's a very distracting fuel and unreliable too. I want to run on careful curiosity and productivity. And productivity in trying to understand what's actually going on for us here. Let's go back to this issue of how constraints compound, how constraints can build upon constraints. I'll start really simple. This is going to sound a little abstract. A lot of people say that I'm too abstract for them. I think what they mean is that I'm too unfamiliar. People don't think about this stuff or talk about it that much. These are what I'll call precise abstractions or concrete abstractions. I don't get to posit anything I haven't explained. Beyond the origins, everything goes towards maximum entropy, that is maximum randomness. And what you've got is what I talked about before, which is form and matter. That's one thing. All matter has form and all form has matter. Okay, I'm trying to explain us, right? And I'm trying to do that in terms of how change changes, what I call metadynamics, changes in how change happens. And I'm going to do that through compounding constraints, how constraints or limitations on what happens can stabilize such that other constraints can evolve or emerge atop them. The process happens in three phases: iteration, reciprocation, and recursion. And I'm going to start at the level of simple chemistry, what I've described before, but I'm going to describe it again. I'm going to take another pass at it in those simple terms: iteration, reciprocation, and recursion. Iteration is more of the same thing, and we get that in chemistry with catalysts. A catalyst is a molecule that has a certain form that makes chemical reactions more likely, changing substrate into product, making it less likely that substrate will remain substrate instead of being changed into product. I've described catalysts before. A molecule that has a certain form or shape is a constraint, it's a cluster flux, that will either lead to the increased splitting of a certain kind of molecule substrate or combining of a certain kind of molecule substrate. So if you drop catalysts into a solution that's got some substrate, then it will generate products, one after the other, like that. That's iteration. But you can also have processes of catalysis pitted against each other in a synergistic way. Here you'd get reciprocation, chain reactions. This is when you would have what we call reciprocal catalysis or autocatalysis, which is One kind of catalyst produces a product, which is another kind of catalyst, which in turn produces the first kind of catalyst. So you get this population explosion of catalysts. The more catalysts there are in this population explosion, the less likely it is that the substrates will remain substrate. Think of it like an epidemic. Think of it like COVID. When COVID was at its peak, you were less and less likely to remain uninfected. So that's what would happen in a chain reaction. You'd be producing more and more catalysts and making it less and less likely that the substrate would remain substrate. Without those catalysts, without the chain reaction, without reciprocal catalysis, those substrates would be much more likely to remain substrate. And then on top of that, there's recursion, which is the same process over again. It's one level up. Reciprocation is the iteration of iteration. Recursion is the iteration of reciprocation. And that's where you get the autogen model that I've shared before here. You've got a chain reaction, a chemical chain reaction that is also producing as a side product these shell molecules that assemble by reciprocal catalysis into shells, right in the midst of the chain reaction, capturing some of the chain reaction molecules, the catalysts, and holding them together close enough that should the shell break open, the chain reaction would resume. That's where we think selves and trying start. It starts with recursion. So iteration produces more product, reciprocal catalysis produces more catalysts, and recursion reproduces the whole process. It reproduces itself. It's self-regeneration. It's making less and less likely the possibility that the self will fail. At the origins of life, it would be very likely to fail. But if you keep on cycling, iteration, reciprocation, and recursion, level upon level, in ways that we are beginning to sketch out, you would get all the way from the origins of life to us. Catalysis, unlikely, that's a verb I'm making up. Reciprocation makes it even more unlikely, you could say exponentially more unlikely, that the substrate will remain substrate. But with recursion, at the origins of life, you get the unlikelifying process that is life. That is, there's unlikelying in inorganic physical chemistry, but we selves unlikelify. We are active. We are agents in our own generation, prevention of our own deaths. That is where I would argue you get the origins of life. So remember, the model we're working from here, and it may seem esoteric. I think that if you spend a little time with it, it becomes really simple. And like I say, it's really important. It's how we're going to overcome the wielding thing we do, which could be the end of civilization. That's my perspective on it. If the only models we've got are the ones that assume abstract second realities like spirit or information, or saying, well, we're nothing but physical chemistry, random chance, and things falling apart, and therefore we can't be alive, we're not selves and trying. If those are our only options, we're doomed. That's my sense of it. So stick with me if you can, if you're willing. I think it's worth it. After all, we're talking about what matters to us most of all, which is our own lives and our own effort and the results of all of that. Then understanding that process, iteration, which generates more product, reciprocal catalysis, iteration, which is catalysts making unlikely some possibilities and produces, therefore, product, reciprocation, which makes still more possibilities unlikely, thereby producing more reciprocal catalysis, and then recursion, which is where you get selves making more selves, selves trying to make more selves. I think that's an important process, and if you're trying to understand how you get from that to us, it's iteration of the whole process. The whole thing keeps on happening over and over, level upon level. Once you've got life, then you get the whole thing going on over and over again, compounding constraints on top of each other. Now let me go back a step to another way to think about the constraint approach to things. I'll keep it really simple. You've got flows in the universe. That is a result of the second law of thermodynamics, is that things fall towards disorder, or they fall by gravity. But one way or another, things are falling. There are flows. Energy flows, material flows, and all of that. But what happens when you get two flows that are flowing against each other? A flow is a constraint. It's not just spilling out everywhere, but it's in its own direction, in some direction. If you get two that are flowing against each other, and that's quite possible in our universe, it happens all the time, what happens? They constrain each other's flows. And then that's where you can begin to understand how constraints compound. You've got flows flowing against each other, what we call contragrade. They're moving against each other. And contragrades sometimes result in new orthogrades. So what do you get, for example, when you run water through a narrowing stream that is flowing towards the ocean, but there are some rocks in the way? Well, eddies can form. What is that? That's flows flowing against each other and falling towards the most efficient flow. It's not going to flow uphill. It's going to gravitate towards the simplest flow. Water's flowing downstream, but you end up with turbulence, and then the turbulence resolves into a constraint, an order, spiral, directionality. It happens all the time. You see this in a crowd. Let's say a bunch of people are exiting a theater through the same foyer, and they're all entering the foyer from different directions, and then they're constrained by too few doors to exit the foyer altogether. So what happens? Well, people are bumping into each other, but they don't want to, and in some places you get slow flows, and then around those slow flows you'll get faster flows, and pretty soon pattern will form. What is that form? It's a constraint on likely directions of flow. That is, some flows become more unlikely, others become more likely. They call it self-organization. It's a terrible name for it. There's no self involved, and it's not like it organizes to one precise state. We call it morphodynamics in this work. It's what you would get, for example, with reciprocal catalysis, and catalysts making more and more of each other. That's a kind of self-organization or flow. Now, a lot of researchers are interested in self-organization, but they tend to assume that once you've got order, like whirlpool, that's tantamount to life. And we're saying no. That's reciprocal catalysis, and life is recursive. It's one level up from that. It's not enough to have a chemical chain reaction, which is what reciprocal catalysis is. That's not enough to be life. It's not trying to do anything. It's not even a thing. It's a bunch of things interacting with a tendency towards generating order. Order meaning that you'll end up with a whole lot of product concentrated in a certain region. It seems to defy the second law of thermodynamics. It's the opposite of entropy production locally. You get this concentration of products from the chain reaction. But that's not life. One reason it's not life is that it moves faster and faster towards product production. It will eliminate more and more of the substrate. It'll convert more and more of the substrate into product until there's no more substrate. And then what happens? Well, it diffuses the concentration. So we're arguing that you need a step beyond that, and that step is recursion. Okay, well, that's a lot. This stuff may seem complicated. I assure you, it's not complicated. It's just foreign. And once again, I think it's important that we try to explain what we are to ourselves, really. I don't think we especially want to know what we are. So I think I'll end with something a little closer to the theme of this series, which is irony is the truest medicine. I don't really want to know what I am. I'd rather think in my world-wielding way I'm an eternal entity, a soul or something like that. I'm reluctant to introspect and figure out what I really am. It would be potentially disappointing. And yet I recognize that I really have to understand what I am. That it'd be beneficial. It'd be useful to me. It'd be useful for the world, for me to try to understand what I am. And so there's some of the irony of it. No matter how hard I chase the truth, it will never catch me. That kind of ambivalence. And yet pushing through the ambivalence, because it is worth it to me to try to understand what I really am. And it leads me to the challenge of, okay, well, I'm not going to transcend my ego. I wouldn't want to pretend that I could. I'm extremely vain, and I'm extremely egotistical. I'm just not vain and egotistical enough to pretend that egotism and vanity are beneath me. So there's the irony of it. I need my sense of heroism. I need to face the music, even if it's disappointing about my heroism. So what do? I engage in activities that enable me to do what I call off-jerking or idsercise, egotainment, where I pretend I'm a hero, and I know I'm pretending. That's the irony I'm after. And in the meantime, I'm rolling up my sleeves and trying to understand what the actual fuck I am. I hope you're intrigued enough to wonder about that with me. I hope you subscribe, share, and above all, I hope you kick the tires on my ideas. The ultimate gift to me is if you comment in the comment section below this. If you get in touch by email, it's very straightforward. My email's everywhere, including in the description of this video. Tell me what's on your mind. Run anything by me. It will inspire next videos. Argue with me, debate me, call me names, whatever. I'm open to all of that. I want to hear what you think. And I'll see you in episode 10. Actually, I won't, because these aren't videos, these are audio, but you'll hear me in episode 10 if you're back. All right, thanks a lot.